So everything that I've just talked about, this whole kind of reflex or this connection between the experience of threat and this particular transcriptomic response in white blood cells, you can sort of think of as a kind of a recipe for how not to live, both figuratively in the sense that it's called forth in circumstances that are unpleasant, but also literally in the sense that if we run these inflammatory response regimes too consistently at high level for too long, we will be precipitating all those diseases I talked about earlier, neurodegenerative diseases, atherosclerosis, metastatic cancer, you name it. If it's there in the chronic illness, sort of epidemiology of today, it's probably fueled at least in part by inflammation. So running this kind of defensive gene expression regime is both, a reflection of unpleasantness and to some extent a forecast of health unpleasantness as well. So great, we don't want to do that. What should we do instead? In other words, how should we be living if we don't want to be living this sense of threat and uncertainty that is calling forth this chronic defensive response that seems to be fertilizing, if you will, lots of different types of chronic disease? So, well, I mean, the obvious answer is, well, don't be miserable and threatened and worried about things. Great, that's easier said than done. And so I was, thinking about this a lot not so long ago. I'd been doing, now a decade and a half or so of work, basically mapping the, sort of molecular machinery that allows our lives to convert misery into death. How fun is that? That's not, I was getting pretty depressed there for a while. And so I thought, well, I should try and figure out what is the best, if you will, sort of intervention strategy for redirecting this molecular biology somehow. And so I started talking to all of these happiness psychologists. I was lucky enough to have gone to grad school with a couple of the people that subsequently became the co-queens of happiness research. And I was talking to one of them, and she was saying, well, I mean, obviously, if you don't want to be miserable, you should be happy. I'm great. How do you make people happy? And she's like, well, which happy are you talking about? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I was largely unacquainted with any form of happiness, so the idea that there was more than one just made me feel like I was missing out more, but whatever. Anyway, she said, well, yeah, we generally distinguish between what you might call hedonic well-being, which is the kind of happiness that comes from having lots of, if you will, happy moments, positive affect. And then there's this other camp that thinks that actually the most deep, enduring, true form of happiness, this camp being inhabited by your grandmother and Aristotle, for example, they generally feel like what you would call eudaimonic well-being is at least distinct from this sort of momentary affective happiness. The eudaimonic well-being is the type of happiness that comes more from dedicating yourself and your efforts to some cause or purpose greater than your own immediate self-gratification. So instead of fueling your own hedonic machinery by watching a funny movie or eating a wonderful meal or hanging out with your best joke-telling friends or something like that, the eudaimonic well-being idea is more, I'm going to go make a difference in this world, or I'm going to help these people, or I'm going to fight for this political cause, or I'm going to keep supporting this community. So we did a study where we just asked, if we had a magic wand and could create whatever kind of intervention we want, which of these two types of well-being is best going to deliver us from that adverse molecular biology that I talked about earlier? So in an initial first-pass study, Barb Fredrickson's group just collected data from, I think, about 70, 80 people, and sort of freely occurring natural individual differences in hedonic well-being, which they measure by items on questionnaires such as how often do you feel happy or satisfied with your life, and contrasted that with measures of eudaimonic well-being, which you can kind of get the flavor of how they tap that. There are more questions about how often do you feel like your life has a sort of direction to it or a sense of meaning. How often do you feel like you're growing and becoming a better person? So after measuring these things, which are, they're definitely correlated with one another, but you can find people that are high on one of these things relative to the other. So we were particularly interested in which of these types of happiness was most, if you will, most perfectly inversely correlated with that adverse gene expression profile. So we measured a bunch of genes involved in inflammation, just a sort of a standard immunologist block of pro-inflammatory cytokines and genes involved in pro-inflammatory transcription factors. And another dimension involving genes that read out this type 1 interferon response, both the interferons themselves and the response genes that they trigger, as well as some of these genes involved in production of antibodies. And so in this readout, I'm going to sort of represent these two different gene expression blocks as different dimensions in two-dimensional space. And I'm going to flip the axis for the pro-inflammatory genes so that if you have a vector in this two-dimensional space that's generally up, that's generally a favorable thing. Low expression of these inflammatory genes and relatively high expression of these interferon-related genes. And vice versa. If you've got a vector headed down, then that's probably an unfavorable thing. More pro-inflammatory gene expression, relatively less expression of these antiviral genes. So turns out that your grandmother and Aristotle are probably right. Eudaimonic well-being seems to be associated. In other words, people with relatively high levels of eudaimonic well-being relative to those with lower levels of eudaimonic well-being tend to have more favorable profiles in this two-dimensional space. Less expression of more expression of interferon-related genes, less expression of these inflammation-related genes. What surprised us is when we looked at people who had high levels of hedonic well-being. So these are people saying, I'm really, really, really happy. But they're saying, yeah, it's not so much because I'm dedicated to some great thing as just like, I just went to the mall and I'm just really happy. I bought a bunch of stuff. Things are great. They had relatively unfavorable gene expression profiles. Now, before we get, kind of too moralistic about all of this kind of thing, because these are correlated dimensions, all we can really say is there are people who have a lot of happiness or a little bit of happiness. It's not really, it turns out, how much happiness you have as whether the degree of happiness you have is associated predominantly with hedonic well-being alone or whether it has a good balance of hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So it's really impossible, it turns out, to sort of tear these things completely apart. But what we thought was interesting about this is that at the level of the brain, what seemed to be going on with these two types of happiness is they were both pretty well correlated with well-being. In other words, if you were to measure the inverse of well-being, like depressive symptoms or anxiety, they're both about like minus 0.8 correlated with those measures of adversity, anxiety, distress, that kind of thing. So at the level of the brain, they seem to be experienced pretty similarly. They're similarly good ways of being not miserable, if you will. But somewhere, the genome was reading things out a little bit differently. It was making much more of a distinction between hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being, at least in this kind of two-dimensional molecular space. So that struck me as interesting because it suggests that somehow our genome is reading out some, if you will, global assessment of how we're doing, how well we are, that is different than our momentary emotional states. And actually, this is one example of a theme that's come up in a wide variety of other domains as well. Our momentary affective experiences of life does not seem to be terribly tightly or even, frankly, modestly correlated with what's going on at the level of the genome. We can find big correlations between adverse life circumstances and gene expression, but often if we ask people, how stressed are you as a sort of a mediating intermediate there, we find relatively little evidence that that is the sort of, if you will, way station, that our conscious experience of stress is really the intermediate state that is transmitting adverse social conditions into gene expression. And yet we're seeing differences in, sort of endocrine function, differences in gene expression. So I think one of the things that's useful about looking at these kind of genomics-based measures of, if you will, well-being is that they're reading out some different nervous system assessment than the one we could get just by asking people about their momentary subjective internal states.